Okay. So if you guys have questions, raise your hand, ask the question. I'm going to actually delegate this to James. Is that okay? All right, James, the floor is yours. We are recording it and looking forward to it.
All right, awesome. Well, welcome everybody. My name is James Serra. Quick introduction of me. I've been at Microsoft about 9 years now. My current role, switched a lot at Microsoft, is data and AI solution architect. We'll go with that. It's officially called a technical specialist, a new role at Microsoft. That was an old role. Anyways, what I spend my days at in Microsoft Federal Civilian, so talking with a lot of government agencies, and I've been in this industry role since January, and then before I was in commercial. And I spent a lot of time talking with customers on architectures and helping them to choose the right products to use for their particular use case. And Fabric is a big one of those now, since it was announced a few months ago. So we'll go through this presentation, give you an overview, spend about an hour, and as I said, I'll pause for questions as we go along in there. I've been doing this a long time. I think I'm coming up with 40 years now. I started SQL Server 1.0 in '89. Before that, I was a COBOL programmer, but we don't need to go into that. I have a book that is coming out probably by the end of the year. If you're an early release program with O'Reilly, you can get a copy of it now. If not, just send me an email. I'll give you the first 7 chapters that are out. A lot of what I talk about today, the book relates to that. A lot about common data architecture concepts, as you see here, and then I get into data fabric, lakehouse, mesh, modern data warehouse in there. So it could, I give this out to a lot of customers and agencies that I've worked with to help them level set on what all these concepts are. And it makes it easier than when you're using Fabric and other products within Microsoft. Today, listed here in green is the topics I'll go over. Probably should take about an hour. There's a lot of stuff I'm not covering. I know you said you have another Fabric session next month. There's a ton of stuff in Fabric on here. So I'll cover maybe 20% of what's in there. There's a lot of other things listed here that I won't cover on here. The big focus will just give you a high level understanding and go into a demo to show you some of its capabilities. When to think about Fabric at a high level, it's this unified solution. It takes all these various products and puts them under one roof, much like Synapse, except this goes a step further and creates SaaS version, software as a service, where Synapse is more platform as a service, and it integrates more products, and they use personas that I'll get into in a minute. But the idea is to have one unified platform for everybody to work with, whether you're a citizen developer, report writer, or whether you're somebody in IT as a data engineer, say. All these products are built on a new product or concept called OneLake. And so no matter what product you use, the data is stored in OneLake in Delta format. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And because all these are products, or essentially they took the past product and they said, let's all make them look similar and let's make them easier and integrate them all together within Fabric. And part of that is getting unification, unified security, the experience, the compute. It's all under one roof on that. So as you go through this, you'll see that everything looks similar, and it's not jumping out to different workspaces like you do now with Synapse, where you have a different interface, different storage, it's all integrated. So it's made it a lot easier. And the key behind making it easier, as I mentioned, is the software as a service. So it's really easy to get started. It's really easy to start building solutions. You'll see in the demo. You won't really even realize you're in Azure. It's not like the Azure portal experience. It's all under Power BI. And it's easy to use because there's very few knobs that you can turn. Now, that could be a good or bad thing that we can get into, but out of the box, it works really well. with almost all use cases on there because everything's auto optimized, auto integrated. I know that could be a challenge. I was a DBA for many years. I like to have a lot of knobs, but they did a great job, Microsoft, in underneath the covers, making this work fast without having to worry about, well, how do I index things and what hash keys do I want to use and how do I set partitions up? All that may be done underneath the covers, but it's hidden from you. And then everything's centralized, including the admin. So you don't have all these different products that have your own administration. It's all done under one. As an example of what it can look like, what the difference is, if you're familiar with Synapse, to create a storage account, it's all this work. A lot of knobs to turn, a lot of parameters and configuration screens you got to go through. With Fabric, if you want to create a lakehouse, you just enter the name of the lakehouse. In Synapse, if you're using Synapse and you want to create a dedicated pool, which has its own relational storage, you have to go through all these settings again to create the workspace and then create the dedicated pool. In Fabric, you just enter the name of the workspace on there, the old warehouse in there. So it's really easy to use. A few things before we jump into demo that I think helps understand at a high level what Fabric is and how it differentiates itself from Synapse is, think of it as taking the Power BI workspace and you're adding all of these SaaS versions of products that were in Synapse to it, and they're adding a few new ones in here. Instead of thinking of it as an evolution of Synapse, I like to think of it as an evolution of Power BI workspace, because the big difference is you're giving all the Power BI users now this additional capability, and it's not just people who were using Synapse before. It's everybody in your company could start using this. Power BI workspaces are eventually all going to be called Fabric workspaces. For now, they still have both of them, but you can think of everything as Fabric workspaces now. And then the capacities, if you're using Power BI, you'll be familiar with the Power BI capacities. They will all become Fabric capacities in the future. Again, now there's two of them, but it's going to be one concept in the future. And if you are using Power BI, all these new workloads are automatically built in. There's nothing more that you have to do other than this, click a slide bar or a checkbox and you get all these capabilities. A big change is the capacity units that you choose that'll get pre-assigned to your tenant and your capacities, and you've got many capacities per tenant. And then you assign workspaces to those capacities. And whatever product you use within Fabric is going to pull from that capacity. So if instead of with Synapse, you're familiar with DWUs, data warehouse units, or Spark clusters, whatever you use, you have to go in there and specify the capacity you want to use for that. That all goes away. You have one capacity. Anything you use within Fabric pulls from that universal bucket. So it makes it a lot easier, and it also helps control costs and track costs a lot better that way too. Again, if you're familiar with Synapse, you know we have the serverless pool, a dedicated pool. Those are gone. You don't even realize when you're using pools. So you can think of it as they're choosing the best of both, but there's no concept of pools anymore. It's all pulling from that universal bucket, no matter what you're using on there, and everything is serverless. And it's all about the data lakehouse. There is no relational storage anymore. There's lakehouse and there's a warehouse. Underneath the covers, they're both storing data in a Delta Lake in a lakehouse on there. So it's all about that data lakehouse concept. Again, there's no Azure portals. There's no idea of subscriptions. You don't have to create storage. It's automatically built from you. And customers don't even realize they're in Azure. They're in Power BI, which underneath the covers is Azure, but they don't realize that. And an important thing is there's a strong separation now between the person who is granted permission to buy things and the people that can actually build stuff. With Synapse, you have the person who's given permission. The person who wants to build stuff has to be given permission to buy stuff on there. So there's a limited amount of people in there. In Fabric, that completely goes away. You're going to have one admin who's going to go there and say everybody has access and can build stuff now. So you really have one person who's got the privilege of the capability to buy stuff for that, but then everybody gets to use it. So in the end, this opens it up, all these features, to a lot more people on there. I think Microsoft said 35 times the amount of people and using Power BI compared to Synapse in here. So yeah, there are some worries with everybody in your company suddenly have access to build lake houses and warehouses and do all sorts of stuff. And we can talk through that, but it also gives everybody the power now to build stuff. And Fabric is the future. So this will be the product to use, whether you're a citizen developer who wants to just build a small little solution, to enterprise IT who wants to build a huge data warehouse project on that. All are using this one platform. Instead of Power BI people and Synapse people, everybody's using this. So there's a lot of benefits from that. One being somebody can build a small solution and then pass it on to enterprise IT without having to change anything. It's all under using the same tool sets. It also makes training and education a lot easier because again, everybody's using the same platform in there. The Fabric is built on the idea of personas, where it's broken out to people who could be a data citizen, to data engineers, to data scientists. The idea is that these personas will likely use a subset of the products on there. Now, they still have the ability to use all the products on here, but the workspace is optimized and tailored to whatever persona you choose. It doesn't do a lot now, but you'll see in the demo what that does. And in the future, it'll be a lot more tailored to individuals in there to make it easier, so they're not overwhelmed with all these choices. If they're a data citizen, they just want to use Power BI and they don't care about the other stuff, that's all they'll see. So a couple of things about workspaces to understand before I go into demo. Again, OneLake is underneath the covers for all this, and it's a true separation of capacity and storage. With Synapse, as much as they said it was a separation, you still had the storage and the compute that were tied to each other when you use dedicated pools. There's a one-to-one relationship on that. That goes away. It's completely separate. Everything uses compute capacity in the universal bucket, and everything lands stuff in one lake, but they're completely separated it out. As an example of how you can lay this out, the idea is you could have tenants. Most companies have one tenant, but you could have multiple tenants. Within each tenant, you will have set up capacities. And then you can have one capacity or multiple capacities. And then each capacity, you set the level of capacity units that can be used. And then you assign workspaces to each capacity. You could have one workspace capacity, likely you'll have multiple workspaces capacity. So this allows you to do all sorts of interesting things. As I can say, hey, the marketing people, they're going to do they need a lot of compute. So I'm going to give them a marketing capacity that has a very high level, and they assign their workspaces to it. Where the finance people, they don't really need a lot of capacity, so I'll have that lower on the limit and then assign the workspaces to that. So this gets into designing how do you want to lay this all out, but now you have the ability to separate out all these capacities by organization within your company, or it could be by products if you wanted. There's all the different variations you can do now. So it's great to have that flexibility. There's so if I go into to create a Fabric capacity, this is what I'll look like. I have a resource side, and that gives me dedicated compute. If I don't use it, I lose it. So you want to be careful in selecting something that is not going to be too much or too little. So this gets into other conversations we have with customers. Eventually, there'll be a sort of calculator you can use to figure out the best resource size to get started with. You can eventually automate going up and down, but for now, you have to manually do it or write a script to do it. So maybe on the weekend, you can say, nobody's going to use this. I'm going to go to a really low SKU, but on Mondays, I want to go pretty higher because a lot of people are going to use it at that time. The capacity units too there's not a heavy ceiling or rigid ceiling on it. So if I have 8 capacity units and I'm the only person using it, I use something that's needs a lot of compute, I can go up to more capacity units. They have this thing called smoothing, and and averaging and bursting and all this stuff. So you can, for a period of time, go above the capacity units on that. That's a whole other topic of conversation, but it gives us some flexibility to allow having bursts of times without having to raise that tier, that skew. If you do raise or lower the tier, it's instantaneous. There is no movement of data or firing up additional VMs or shutting them down. So like you do with Synapse. So it happens right away if you do need to move it up and down. And so what you'll do is you'll create these capacities. You'll see it on the admin portal. And then when you go and create a workspace, you will see on the bottom right the ability to assign that workspace to capacity. So again, you could have multiple workspaces on one capacity if you wish. The way you turn on Fabric is just, there's this enabled slider there, and that's it. You go under admin, under tenant settings. Obviously, not many people are gonna have this permission to do that, but once they do, everybody gets it, but they could limit it out by groups on here if they wanted. Now, there's also, when you create the capacity, you can specify that you want to override it. So people who cannot be allowed to access that at the tenant level this could override it, and they can access it at the capacity level on that. So this is, you kind of want to think through all this when you're setting up your environment. And then lastly, to clarify, you can use a Microsoft Fabric trial, which is 60 days, and the Microsoft Fabric stuff is free, not the Power BI stuff is free. So yeah, you get a trial, it supports the Fabric. If you have Power BI capacity now, premium capacity, you can use the Fabric capacities. Eventually, all of this will be all called Fabric, but for now, we separate it out still, and you have Power BI capacities and Fabric capacities. All right, so enough of that. Let me go to demo. If you have any questions, I can pause there.
Questions? No questions so far.
All right, so if I go into Fabric, the only way you even know that your Fabric comparator, what's in Power BI, is in this bottom left. You have this little icon here. Because if I go and I choose these personas here that I mentioned, if I choose Power BI, it looks very much like Power BI on there. So sometimes I've had to tell users, no, you're actually in Fabric. You can see at the bottom left. If I go to the bottom left, I click Microsoft Fabric, I go to the home page, and from there or on this menu, I can select a persona. So if I were to go and say select data engineering, what you'll see here is what Microsoft thinks a data engineer, signified up here, is going to want to mostly do. And really, personas right now, that's really it. Nothing else is customized. Eventually, there'll be more. But it's okay. Hey, and this is what I'm going to, as an engineer, typically going to use. But under here, there's this create button. And if you click that, you have access to everything. So no matter what persona you're in, you can still get access to everything. That causes a little concern, and eventually they're going to say, hey, if you select Power BI persona, we can lock you in to only have that persona, and then we can lock you in and only be able to do Power BI things in there. But right now we don't have that. This is all in public preview. It'll GA sometime in the future. I can't really say what date on there. You can kind of get an idea if you look at the major conventions Microsoft has. Usually it's all around that. And so if I look at Power BI, that's what I can pretty much do now under Power BI. But I have all these other things I need here: real-time analytics, warehouse, data science stuff, data factory stuff, data engineering stuff, and a new product called Data Activator, which you may not see in your portal, which I won't get into, and there'll be more coming down the road on here. So these are all now SaaS solutions, not just PaaS solutions. So as an example, how easy to get started is, generally a customer is going to go in here. They're going to say, I want a lakehouse on here. Now, OneLake is already built on here. So the storage is already there. And then when you create a lakehouse, essentially behind the covers, you just enter the name, and it's creating think of it as folders within OneLake. I mean, technically it's Data Lake Store Gen 2, but the idea is all that creating storage is all abstracted from you. You just enter a name. Once you enter that name, as an example, I have Sales Lakehouse I created previously. It only takes a few seconds. And what you'll be presented with is this Explorer screen here. And this is where you start out with, I can come into the file section, and then I can say, I want to upload files and start doing things with them. Now, I could also use Data Factory and land stuff in the air outside of Fabric or within it. You could use various tools to land stuff in here. So this is the manual way of doing it. I can just upload files here. Also, and they call OneLake because of the ease of use of it, they call it like the OneDrive that you have. And to that point, here I have a couple of OneDrives up here. But you add this, you download this little app, and it creates a OneDrive, essentially that's connected to OneLake. So I can also upload and move stuff around through my regular file explorer in Windows in here. Let's say I go through this way, I upload some files. Now what happens is this file section is called an unmanaged section, and I can upload anything to it. That's what that means. I can upload video files if I want to. So, but if I upload something that it recognizes a table, and eventually it'll recognize various file formats. Right now, it only recognizes Parquet, and even that's kind of iffy. It doesn't always work. And if it doesn't work, you just right-click and you say load to tables. So for example, if I upload a Canada file, eventually it's going to automatically notice that it's a table, and it's going to copy it into this table section. Once it copies it to the table section, it then lists that here what is in that file. So right away, I can get insights into what's in that file. Now, behind the scenes, if I right-click this and I go to View Files, it's actually copied that file and stored it in Delta Lake format. That's what we mean by, that's what you see when you have Delta, it's a Delta log, and there's Parquet files, which is what Delta stores it in there. But we hide that from the end user. They don't really need to know that. All they see is, boom, as soon as I upload a file, this is awesome, I can see what's in there. Now, they may say, well, I want to go one step further. I want to filter stuff in there or query it or create a report off of it. What you can do then, and on top right is this Lakehouse mode, I call it. I can switch from Lakehouse mode to SQL endpoint mode. What this does is it fires up additional products or features on top of the tables. So the tables are really files on here, but they look to be tables and are underneath this table section. And if I look at that Canada one, if I right click it, I can do new SQL query. I can get the top 100 on there, and it pops up. And now I can start using T-SQL on top of that. Once I get it and filter it, do all the things I want with it, if I love T-SQL, I can then create an Excel file or go right into Visualize Results, which will take what I've created and create a data set. And from that data set, I can then build a Power BI report and then save that and use that in the future. So this is all integrated. I'll show more of this in a second. Now, I may go and say, well, I don't really like T-SQL. I don't know anything about it, but I do like Power Query because I've used that in Power BI. If I go and click on Visual Query, what happens is this jumps into the Power Query interface. Now they call it data. Well, I'll get into that. They call the naming here a little different on here, but behind the scenes, it's Power Query. Microsoft loves changing the names of things and does that to confuse us, but I'll try to straighten that out later. But in this SQL endpoint, it's Power Query in here. So if end users are familiar with Power Query and they don't want to use T-SQL or they want to use both, they have the option in here. Now I can start doing all that filtering and creating columns and a lot of the power in Power Query. And again, once I'm done, I can put it in Excel or create a report from it, which will create a data set. Also, I can wind up uploading a bunch of different tables, which are files. and then I can then create relationships between those. So right here, you can see I've created, uploaded a few tables, fact and dimension tables, and then they are simply created the relationships. Now, previously, this was only available in desktop. Now this is available in Fabric. And the idea is, can we do everything within Fabric? Well, not yet. Not everything in desktop is there yet. It'll eventually will be. But right now, they've added a few things. And the modeling is one important feature that's in there. So now I can model things in here. So the idea is an end user doesn't have to be too technical to start immediately getting results and insights into the data. And once they go through this, they can create their own data set, or once you upload a file in here, and once you create a lakehouse in here with files in here, it automatically creates a default data set. So if I go and look at the workspace on here, I will see for that sales lakehouse. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, if you go to workspace here, here's where I create a new workspace. And within that workspace is where I would choose Fabric capacity, which will then ask me what capacity I want to use. And and so right now I'm in what's called the Fabric tutorial workspace on here, and that's everything I create now is lands in there. And so that sales lakehouse, you'll see it creates a data set by default with everything I upload into that sales lakehouse. So if I click on that and I wanted to quickly do a report, I can start from scratch or do an auto create, which will go and pre-select some data for me, which I can change, and then create a report, so insights to the data. And now this creates a dashboard, or it's really a report that will give me some of that information on here. And you can see it picked by default the total sales amount, and it got use product subcategory. I can change that and say, well, I'd rather have product name. And so it's just a matter of clicking these, and you get additional insights into the data. So it's a very quick and easy way to see stuff and get value out of it. Now, going one step further, everybody knows about ChatGPT, which uses OpenAI, and Microsoft's come out with Copilot, that you may have seen that name in a lot of things. Copilot everywhere, from using it within Windows to using it to look through PowerPoint, to write an email, to writing code. Eventually, it'll be in a lot of different areas within Fabric. And one in particular will be for Power BI report writing. And you can see a demo of this. None of this is available yet. It's not even in, it's very limited private preview, but you can imagine going to the screen and just using English commands to say, create a report for me that gives me the total sales amount by product name, use a particular graph and use particular colors and base it off of a template I previously created, and boom, it creates it all. It's very impressive, and it's an accelerator to get insights to your data and do it a lot quicker without having to have a lot of technical skills.
James, do
All right,
you mind if I ask a question?
there. Yeah, that was my stopping point for questions.
So I'm not sure if you agree with me, but I see this Lakehouse as a essentially competitor to Databricks. And I guess the scenario that I'm trying to ask you about, let's say I work for a company, we want to build a lakehouse. We like this idea. So now I have the option to do it with Databricks. I have the option to do it with Fabric. What do you see what do you see as advantages for Fabric to go that direction, and let's say disadvantages that will favor going with Databricks?
Yeah, so you've asked a perfect segue question. So I'll jump into what I was going to show next. It was like you planned this, and I paid you some money on the side to do this, because that's right when I almost always get that same question. So to answer it, and I think it's a really good answer that you're going to hear, is through the use of shortcuts in OneLake. So going back to my Explorer, if I right-click this or click on this, you see this idea, this ability to create, where is it? To create shortcuts here. And so what this means is OneLake becomes sort of the center of the universe where I can store data locally within OneLake. I can also create shortcuts to data that sits in other parts of Fabric or is external in Data Lake Store Gen 2 or even in Amazon or eventually Google and eventually SQL Database and Cosmos DB. So if you're familiar with Synapse Link, this is going to replace that and go one step further with it. So I can create all these shortcuts, and the only way I even know the shortcuts, if I look on here, you see that little, whoops, where'd it go? Oh, what happened to my shortcuts? Let me jump to another one. I think I may have it. And here, the thing with public preview, sometimes stuff just disappears. But so right here, you'll see I have these little, they're shortcut symbols. And if I click on this, I get insights into that data. That's a shortcut. Now that shortcut could be in another Fabric in the same region, or it could be in a data lake store across the world, or it could be in Amazon. And to the end user, if I create all these shortcuts, they don't know or even care that it's not local. They just see it as all local. So think of this as a lightweight virtualization layer that's going to eventually be very powerful on there. Kind of like you can do in Power BI with data sets to everything else. That's what this is. Now, to answer your question, after I show you how the shortcuts, Microsoft has a very good relationship with Databricks. We always will have a good relationship with Databricks. It is a competitor. It's not a competitor. You can have that argument. But the idea is we're always going to work together well. Why? Because a lot of people use Databricks. The reason Microsoft uses Delta Lake underneath the covers, because Databricks created it, and they want to play nice with Databricks because there's other competing technologies like Iceberg, but Microsoft went with Delta Lake because Databricks open sourced this. So what this means is I can create stuff in Fabric and use it outside of Fabric and vice versa. So to answer your question specifically now, after I went long-winded on here, is I could have Databricks where I create a medallion architecture in Databricks. And if I want to use that OneLake, I just create a shortcut to it. And now I'm using it. Now, shortcuts are only read-only. So I can't be in OneLake and write to it, but I can read from everything. So Databricks can be writing data to it, and I can, within OneLake, read it. So that's how one way we play nice. The other way we play nice is I could be in Fabric, and I can create the medallion architecture, and then somebody in Databricks wants to use it. They just create essentially a shortcut to it, and now they're using it. And this could apply to any product that can read Delta Lake, which is most things. So you could build something in Fabric and use it outside of it, or you can build something outside of it and use it within Fabric. Delta Lake's the common format for all of that. Did that help?
So data virtualization seems to be one strong aspect of Fabric that Databricks doesn't have. What about things like cost, performance? Can you comment a little bit on this now that we have a pricing for Fabric? How does it compare to, let's say, Databricks if I want to build similar architecture, and also performance? So let's say I have my data loaded in medallion architecture or just as files. I want to do some analysis on top of that. So we have a SQL endpoint. Also, we have the analysis services direct lake. Does that give me comparable performance to Databricks, or which one is better?
Yeah, so you're opening up a can of worms, and it depends on who you talk to. So I will say, in my experience, it all depends on what you're doing. So if I'm using Fabric, I always like, well, would you use Spark? And I talk to customers, and if they're using Databricks, if they're using Spark, continue to use Databricks. Continue and have fun with Spark. Maybe you want to use the Spark version within Fabric. Maybe you want to use Databricks on there. If they come to me and I say, do you want to use Spark? And they give me a blank stare, I'm going to say, don't even think about Spark. Just use the visual tools within Fabric until you can. If there's some situation that comes along where you need extra performance or a certain library, then maybe you want to use Spark. So I find with most customers, the choice is kind of already made. If they're using Databricks, continue to use Databricks. Now, if they get into specifics on there and they need to use Spark, but I'm not sure which one on there, cost-wise, you can argue that Fabric is more cost-effective because you have a universal bucket. And because of that, I can do things cheaper. I mean, you can argue the other way too with that. I do find most times it is with Fabric, I think it will be cheaper than Databricks because of that universal bucket. Performance-wise, Microsoft uses open source Spark. They have their own performance enhancements to it, and Databricks does too. So for example, we have a thing called vOrder within OneLake. When you store stuff, you can store it in this vOrder that can give you a boosted performance, especially when you get to loading data into Power BI because of this new thing called Direct Lake, which I'll talk in a minute. And Databricks doesn't have that, but Databricks will say, well, we got our own special things on that. So I would say overall, and honestly, Databricks, if you're just a Spark person, is going to be a little bit faster than the Spark. But what is your use case in there? And most times, if you're in Fabric, you're building some data warehouse. Most people are not the data scientists that are maybe doing a lot of Spark. Those people are usually already using Databricks on there. So a lot of it gets down to, I just need a little bit of Spark. We'll just go and use what's in Fabric because it's right there. It's easy to use. You're not worried about things taking a few extra seconds on there. But if you are deep into Spark and you do need to squeeze out your performance, then Databricks will probably be a little bit faster than that for you.
Gotcha. We have, I think, at least a couple of questions. I think you were the first one over there. Yeah.
Two questions.
Yes.
We anticipate different best practices with this OneLake versus the Data Lake Gen 2 of the past.
Okay.
They're anticipating some different patterns.
Sure.
Second question, unrelated to the first one, do they foresee the ability to have video types data in the one data lake to then be analyzed through some kind of journal using some library, Python libraries or analytics? Is that something that is just, we want to all combine everything into Fabric as an example?
Got it. So a couple of questions here. I'm not sure if you were able to catch that, but essentially the first question was, if you compare OneLake with just Azure Data Lake Gen 2, ADLS Gen 2, are there any different best practices, the way I understand it, that applies to OneLake but don't apply to ADLS 2 and vice versa?
Yeah, I will say it's pretty close to similar. Now, there's one caveat. I will mention that Microsoft is working on best practices, so they'll come out with that on how to design your OneLake. But a lot of it is still the same, whether you're using Databricks or any data lake. How many layers do I have? Gold, silver, bronze, cleaned. I have a lot of blogs on that. My book talks a lot about that. Most people are in agreement that you have multiple layers in there. And then, well, okay, within the layers, how do I design it? How are the folders laid out? Because I got to think of performance and security and complexity, and it's all pretty much the same, whether you're using the lake house, OneLake or a general lake house. Now, a little more complexity, but also flexibility is the ability to have those shortcuts in there. So you want to think through that. Behind the scenes, there is performance enhancements. If you have a shortcut and it's going to pull data from Amazon, it's only going to pull data that's requested, and it's going to cache it. So any future calls will use that data. It'll also check if it's been updated, and if it is, it'll pull it over. So we have a lot of customers who use Amazon, especially in the government, and this is a big benefit to them, Fabric, because they don't want to copy all their Amazon data over and then have to keep it synchronized. Now they just create a shortcut to it, and it's only pulls over what's needed, reduces the egress charges, and it has performance because it's cached. So some of that stuff you want to think through. Now, the one caveat that exists within OneLake that'll eventually be fixed or enhanced is underneath the files, I can create subfolders. I cannot do that underneath tables. So I don't want to have a data lake that's got, I can't say bronze, silver, and gold on here because I can't do tables. And I don't want to put everything in there unless I prefix things with bronze, silver, and gold, but generally you don't want to do that. So the best practice you'll see is create 3 lake houses of bronze, silver, gold. And then when you want to use the others, just create shortcuts to them on that. So there's some of that'll come out. So I will say most of it is data lake design, which I talk to a lot of customers is similar, but there are a few nuances that you want to be aware of.
Got it. And the second
Yeah.
question was specifically to video content. So the way I understood it is that if you have video, if you want to load video files, are there any libraries that would allow us to process these files? Is that right? And do I understand that right? Or
Yeah, with the idea of having a centralized environment to which any types of data can then be processed through widely available Python libraries or anything that you like. Is that something that anticipate doing everything in there?
yeah, is it possible to, so do you anticipate in future to have, let's say, Fabric to have support of special libraries for processing video content that are built directly into Fabric? I guess that's the question, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost, well, there's one way of doing that now. If I had a video file here, I can right click it and, well, this isn't a good example. I can go in, I won't go through it all, but I can go into Spark and I can, and they made it real easy. I can just say, I want to use this lakehouse and it's there and it generates the code. And then I can say within this lakehouse, I want to use this video file, and then I can use whatever library I want. So you're doing that all through Spark. So you can do that right now. And a lot of customers do that. So whatever library I want to call. Now in the future, they're going to integrate cognitive services through this, which they haven't done yet. I don't know when that's going to come out, but they'll simplify that process and not have to go and use a Spark notebook. But for now, it's all through Spark Notebook.
Gotcha. Cool. And you had a
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, so he spent some time talking about Lakehouse. He's talked about, Databricks. He also, on the outline, I saw he's going to do a comparison between Lakehouse and Warehouse. But I was wondering if he could talk about differences between Warehouse and Databricks. What use cases I should use each one of those tools,
Yes.
which is a better option for which situations and cost implications.
All right.
Yeah.
So did you get that question?
Yeah, I got that. So that's another good segue into Lakehouse. What the heck is the difference between a lakehouse and a warehouse on that? So if I go into a previously created warehouse on here, again, you just enter a name on here. And well, let me pull up. The good thing under browser, they have the ability to do favorites, so you don't have to go look through a long list. So I'll pull up a warehouse I created before. This warehouse, we'll use this warehouse sample. And so what this interface looks like is just like the lakehouse. You just don't see that initial lakehouse mode because there's no uploading files here. You're going to use like Data Factory to land data in here. Or actually I should jump to that. I can go and create a lakehouse. I can use Data Factory or within Fabric pipelines and data flows to land. Whoops, this is my lakehouse. Where's my warehouse? There it is. Pipelines and data flows to put it in there. Eventually there's a mount. I won't get into that. It's not there yet. And so I can land data in there in the warehouse. And once I do that, it's just like I showed you before. The same tools apply. I can use T-SQL, Power Query. I can model the data, and then I can create reports from it. And then I can save queries. I can do this in the other one, in Lakehouse too. And I even have the ability to use 3-part queries in here. So that was a good thing to point out in, well, let me pull up my other demo lakehouse, right, this one. This has these 3-part queries on here. And just to explain this briefly is I can create shortcuts to lake houses or warehouses that are outside of my workspace. I don't need to do that if they are locally. And once I create the shortcuts or I want to use something local, it's all three-part naming conventions. It's whether it's a lake house or a warehouse, a schema, and a table. So in this example, I'm doing a bunch of, it's not the greatest example, but I'm showing how I can connect to lake houses and warehouses that are local or via shortcuts in different workspaces on here. So something we didn't have before with Synapse in here. So this means I can have all these workspaces, each of them can have their own capacity that all can point to the same warehouse. So I can have very high concurrency and no relational storage, no one-to-one relationship like you had with Synapse. So this is where, if you're familiar with Snowflake, we're catching in. Microsoft is really came out with Fabric to compete better against Snowflake, and I think they'll catch them and pass Snowflake. And one of the things that we didn't have was the ability to do this three-part naming conventions on that, and that's there now. And so you say, okay, well, why do we have a lake house and a warehouse? And I was very confused about this, but the warehouse is very much like you had in Synapse with the SQL engine on top of it and on top of relational storage, just now and Delta storage. And that's the big difference. So when we compare the two, this took me a while to try to make it hopefully easy to understand is, if think of a persona, if you are a data engineer, meaning you like Spark, you want to use a Spark engine, you want to use notebooks, you want to use all these different types of languages on here, you want to use Spark SQL, you're going to want to use a lakehouse because only with a Spark engine can you write to a lakehouse. This is the big difference. What you're writing, what do you need to write with? If I need to write with Spark notebooks, it's got to be a lakehouse. I can also use data pipelines and data flow to land and write stuff in the lakehouse, but for those coders, it's going to be lakehouse. If I'm a SQL person like me, I like SQL engine, I'm going to pick the data warehousing persona. I can use T-SQL to its fullest. Caveat, it doesn't have full SQL support yet, but I can use most T-SQL. I can use store procedures. I can use my SSMS data studio tools if I want. And I'm going to use T-SQL through the engine to write to the warehouse. Again, I can use the pipelines and Dataflow Gen 2, which is what they call Power Query. So that's the big difference, is what are you going to write to? Now, Microsoft's got a documentation that explains when we use one or the other. This all comes down to Delta Lake has some shortcomings. One of them being is multiple table transactions. If I want to do a begin transaction, update a bunch of tables, and do an end transaction, I cannot do that in a lakehouse. Because Delta Lake, while they tout they support ACID transactions, it does, but only for one table. It won't do it across multiple tables. So if I have a use case that needs to do that, I'm going to have to go with the warehouse. If I want full support, I want to use T-SQL to write to it, and then I have to use warehouse because T-SQL cannot write against lakehouse. If I'm doing a lot of, and I list them here, a lot of trickle updates, which are very small updates, deletes, or inserts, I may have performance issues with that using a lakehouse, so I want to use warehouse in that case. And then finally, the lake warehouse here supports schemas, but we don't support that with lakehouse because it's a file and folder based system. So more clarity on when you want to choose one and the other. Now, hopefully one day Delta Lake adds support for all those things, and then we don't have two of those. But for now, you have to make a decision based on what hopefully I listed here on which one to use. No matter which one you pick, you can read from it. So if I write it in a lakehouse or read in a warehouse, I can do in both. That's what I explained here. I can write in Spark, and here it's lakehouse. I can write in T-SQL, and in here it's warehouse. I can then use T-SQL and read from both, or Spark and read from both, and then I can decide maybe I want to write it into a warehouse. And that's where we get a little bit, I touched on before, data lake design. And if I'm using a medallion architecture, an example may be I'm going to use Spark to write data. Okay, that means I have to use a lakehouse. So there's my raw layer. maybe most people in my company are like Spark and they want to use it to clean the data. Okay, it's got to be a lakehouse cleaning the data. Then they may say, well, when we give this clean data to the end users, they like T-SQL, they've used T-SQL, they may want to write T-SQL. Then I can decide I want to take all that data or maybe some of that data and use T-SQL to write it to a warehouse. And therefore they can write using T-SQL and they can have more support for T-SQL because it's in a warehouse. This is much better than Synapse, which meant you'd have to copy it to relational storage and use dedicated pools. No problem with that. No use of that anymore. Everything's in Delta Lake. So I could say I want to use Lakehouse for everything. I can use a warehouse for everything, or I can get into maybe my gold warehouse will be also a gold lakehouse, and I'll have pieces in both. And I have this flexibility, right? It all comes down to think of what you're going to write the data to, and that's going to drive most of the decision of whether a lakehouse or a warehouse.
Right. And this is where I think also this is an advantage for Fabric compared to Databricks personally, because nobody forces you to adopt any pattern like Lakehouse. So it's kind of a file-based your analytics. You know, if you want, if I'm a SQL developer, I can use SQL, right? So I can do whatever I want.
T-SQL.
All of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, both of them write to Delta Lake behind the scenes. They're both file-based, but it's really a choice for you what language you want to use, right? So it's quite a bit of flexibility in there, right?
Right. It's a lot of flexibility in there. And I go to customers and they have hundreds of people using T-SQL. And if you mention going to Spark SQL, they're like, that's going to, even though it's pretty similar, it's enough of a training issue that they want to avoid that. And this is what really opens it up, is now I can use T-SQL for all of this on here. And you saw the interface, how easy it is to go and read and write using T-SQL on that. And that's the whole idea, of make this really simple for people to use. And you'll get broad adoption because of that.
Yes.
Two quick question on what you're saying. So like from a capacity perspective, is it, Spark more resource intensive from a capacity sense than using T-SQL? Is it hard to say? I'm just trying to understand what's going to be more performant,
Yeah.
Did you get
there?
Yeah.
I got that. Yeah, there's it's in another deck of mine, but and it's documented. They use capacity units, and you'll see in there it says Spark will use an average of 8 capacity units compared to Power BI. They may use 1 compared to T-SQL, and so they kind of give you the difference, and it eventually comes up and says, Spark's going to use more capacity units compared to using T-SQL. So you can see that in the documentation on there. Now, how much of the capacity units do you actually need? That's a little bit up in the air. And then the other thing that I'll mention is, by default, if you go into use Spark, it's called I think it's called the starter pool. Again, we hide the idea of how much capacity you're using, how much of a cluster you're using. It's all hidden. But there is actually, I'll go and show it. If you go to your workspace and you click on this workplace settings, if I go to data engineering science, the Spark compute, most people, you're not going to care, but there's a starter pool on here, and this is what it uses by default. Eventually you can customize this. So I said before, it uses universal bucket, which it does, and most people are not going to care because it's automatically going to use compute and scale up and down. But you can come in here and eventually change the default starter pool for everybody. You can also create a new pool where I can create a specific size and then allow only certain people to use that. So there's a knob you can turn if you need to. And that's what you'll see with a lot of things. Eventually there'll be more knobs, but we don't want to have too many knobs. Then it becomes, we're going back to Synapse days.
Cool. All right. Thank you.
All right. Cool. Yeah. And I'll send this deck out after this. I'll send it to you, Leo, and so everybody has a copy of it. Because I go more in detail on the difference between Lakehouse and Warehouse, And I talk a little bit about differences when using shortcuts. It can be confusing. It took me hours to create this slide, so hopefully you can use it and then better understand when do you create shortcuts, when you don't, and how all that works. Just two more things I want to point out. One is Data Factory, and this is the way I talk with customers. Say, look, let's level set. We have in Data Factory, we have pipelines, we have data flows, which are also still called mapping data flows, and we have Power Query, which we used to be called wrangling data flows, still somewhat called that. So you have those three options in here. Now, Power Query came after mapping data flows, and Power Query is least arguably easier to use. And I'll explain why that's important in a second. Within Synapse, which is now old school, we have pipelines called the same thing. They have data flows. Interestingly, it's got a space between the data and the flow, which I'll explain in a minute. And so it's the same naming conventions. However, Synapse does not have Power Query. Power BI does have Power Query without the space in there. That's just Power Query. And so this is the state of our world. Now, when we go into Fabric, Fabric has pipelines. They call it data pipelines. So pretty much the same thing. Data flows, mapping data flows do not exist within Fabric. The reason being, as I said, Power Query is essentially newer and easier, arguably, to use. So why have two products that essentially do the same thing? So they decided no more mapping data flows, and instead we're going to take data flows, which within Power BI and within Data Factory don't have the scalability that they want, that exist in mapping data flows. So they're adding additional scalability and performance to the data flows that are in Fabric. And that's why they call it Data Flow Gen 2 compared to what's in Power BI, which is called Data Flow Gen 1. So the idea is Power Query is going to have all the capabilities and performance that you get from regular data flows. We're going to be in Power Query. And so maybe I'm not happy that they call this Gen 2. It's confusing, but in summary, that's what they have in Fabric. Now, the first thing people ask is, well, wait a minute, I built all these things in Synapse or Data Factory and then mapping data flows. Am I out of luck? No. There is the ability to mount your mapping data flows and your pipelines and your Power Query into Fabric from Data Factory. They call it mounting, but it's really copying it over. So I can copy all this stuff over, and I can even edit mapping data flows within Fabric, even though we don't support it. So this is important. If you're creating a new project, use Power Query, don't use mapping data flows. That will exist soon, that mounting capability to go from Data Factory to Fabric, but they don't have something to mount from Synapse to Fabric. So yes, you're out of luck right now if you create mapping data flows in Synapse. Eventually they'll have that. I don't know when. That's longer term. And this goes into a long conversation I have with customers usually on how do I migrate? What should I do now in Synapse to use Synapse for now and then switch to Data Fabric when it GAs? And I go through like, well, don't use mapping data flows, number one on that. There's other things I go through. That's a separate conversation. And I do have slides in here that talks through that. When should I use Fabric now? If building in Synapse, how to make transactions smooth and how to handle migration products, which you can read on your own or ask questions now. But that's the story with Data Factory. Any questions on that?
Questions about Azure Data Factory?
Yeah, the integration within Fabric.
Integration.
Now you can do all of this in Data Factory and you can land in one lake. There's the connectors I don't think are there yet. There'll be connectors to Lakehouse and Warehouse.
Yeah.
They're not there yet. Expect them in a month or two.
Yeah, that was my question. So let's say I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket, Fabric, and pretty much have my pipelines and everything in there. I want to keep them outside in Azure Data Factory Studio. When can will I be able to do that? Because right now ADF doesn't have connectors doesn't know anything about Fabric actually.
Yeah. So I had pinged the PM and he said about 1 or 2 months, Data Factory will have connectors to Lakehouse and Warehouse within one lake.
Okay, awesome. I guess no question. Oh, there is a question.
Just say your enterprise is adopting all these new tools, right? You have established warehouses or lake houses, whatever they are, and the business is actually using the data. Now you find that with some of these tools that you're adopting, you mess up the data. Always happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have the ability to time travel and then get back the old version.
It's a good question. So I'm not sure if you got this, James, but the idea is that, let's say a business has adopted these technologies, lakehouse, warehouses, but let's say there was an issue, issue being that data was wrongly changed for one reason or another. Maybe the user, now that we give this technology to the hands of the business users, they actually write some Power Query, they overwrite the data, they mess up. Is Microsoft planning the ability to time travel to undo changes that were erroneously done, or something like that?
Yes, we support that to a limited extent now. So Delta Lake, one of the benefits of it, and if those don't understand, Delta Lake is just adding additional features on top of a data lake. It's not its own storage. It's giving you features like ACID transactions, the ability to do commands like SQL commands like update, delete, and insert, which don't exist within a data lake. There's a bunch of other things that Delta Lake adds on top of a data lake. And one of those too is time travel. So anything that gets stored in the Delta Lake, that's where you store that Delta log. Part of that is tracking the changes. It's not like old school versioning in mainframes where it copies a whole version of the file. It copies the changes to that file and the versions that way. So it optimizes storage. So yes, Great Delta Lake has time travel where right now it works, but only within Spark. So if I land stuff in Delta and the lake house and I want to go and answer that question, I want to select, and you can do, I think it's the commands as of this certain date, it'll go through the time travel and say, okay, here's the data as of the date of you selected. So it does that. It works in Synapse against lake houses. Eventually, it'll work within warehouses because warehouses are using Delta Lake. And eventually it'll work through the T-SQL endpoint. It doesn't do that yet. Even if you're using Lakehouse with a T-SQL endpoint, it doesn't know what time travel is. You have to go into a workbook, a notebook, and Spark Notebook for that. So Spark Notebook right now, eventually, Spark Notebook for Lakehouse is now eventually T-SQL will understand time travel within lakehouses, and eventually T-SQL will understand time travel within warehouses. That I would probably say that's after GA when that's going to come.
Cool. Yes.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Been working with Delta Lake for quite a while now, and one thing I find frustrating is that there's no primary key constraints that are enforced, unique constraints that are enforced, and secondary indexes. So I'm wondering if there's any plans, or if anyone knows of any plans of when those sort of things might be released with Delta Lake, so like helping protect the integrity of the data.
Did you understand that?
Yeah, I got that. And I have another presentation. I don't know if I gave it to your group, Teal, but it was on data lakehouse, data warehouse, data fabric, data mesh. And in that, I bring up Delta Lake. While they try to make it relational data warehouse like a relational storage and a SQL engine, it doesn't have all the features. They've added a lot to it. But one thing they haven't added is referential integrity. And you're out of luck. Honestly, there is no referential integrity with Delta Lake in there. So how do you enforce that? In code, you'd have to do it. There's no behind the scenes. It's going to automatically come up and say, well, you can't do that. Behind the scenes, if you do that in SQL, it'll come up and throw an error message that you can't do something like that. And for now, in the future, Delta Lake is so Delta Lake by itself, I don't know if it'll ever have that, but Microsoft is going to add features on top of Delta Lake, which is weird because Delta Lake's on top of Data Lake, but it's going to add additional functionality within Delta Lake. Now that is going to be handled through what is not there yet called One Security. So it's supposedly not only going to be security, but it's going to be referential integrity along with it. For example, if I want to have row-level security, column level security, I can't do that within Delta Lake, another shortcoming. Within the One Security, you'll have row-level security on top of the Delta Lake that'll move along with the data. So no matter what product you're using, it'll honor that row-level security and that column level security and that referential integrity. But I would say that's like next year in that. So hopeful that'll come out, not too far in the future. But this is the problem. And when I talk to people about Delta Lake, I said there's a lot of great things about Delta Lake, but like anything, there are trade-offs. And one of them, I mentioned a few before, too, is referential integrity. You have to handle that within code.
Yep.
Because underneath the cover, Delta Lake are just files. They don't understand what referential integrity is, right? So unless Microsoft does it kind of in addition to Delta Lake, you'll never see it in Delta Lake. Well, I shouldn't say never, but I haven't heard anything about Delta Lake ever having doing anything with referential integrity. It's always been handled outside of Delta Lake.
Any other questions? No further questions. So we have a few more minutes.
Yeah,
James,
let me cover this one thing. This is important if it's okay. Direct Lake. So, and Power BI people know we have direct query, right? What's the problem with direct query? It's real time, but it's slow. We have import. Import's great, very fast, but it's latent, right? Your data is only as updated since the last refresh. What they come out with is Direct Lake. And this is the best of both worlds in there. Because underneath the covers, Parquet is a lot like what the storage and memory that Power BI uses, the tabular model, it's very similar. So what they do with Direct Lake is what I call on-demand import. When you go and use something that's sitting in one lake, on the fly, it'll import it and put it in memory. And if something else comes along that wants to use it, it's just going to use what's in memory, but it'll also check if something's been updated. If something's been updated, it'll import it. It only imports what's needed. So not like a full refresh, you just import everything. And it's very fast. So yeah, there is a little lag the first time it's got to pull it, but you're talking like milliseconds in some cases on that. So now you have that best of both worlds. So you don't have to have any more scheduled imports. And also, I touched on this before, there's a thing called vOrder. So to get even more performance, there's a vOrder, there's another thing called Optimize Write. So these are performance enhancements just from Microsoft within Fabric that you can do to get even faster loading with Direct Lake. Now, if you do that to a file, it's a performance enhancement on the file in Delta Lake. You can still use that file within Databricks. It just won't use those performance enhancements on that, but it doesn't lock you out of that. So we see a lot of customers now just using Direct Lake, and it works. It's stored that way by default in Data Factory, or I should say pipelines on here. So you can go and now create a Direct Lake Power BI report, and it'll use Direct Lake. Now there's a lot of stuff that goes underneath it, because there are times it could switch to direct query. There's a lot of this page right here is this link right here is multiple pages of going into details about it. But for most use cases I've seen, it's really fast, and this is what makes Fabric really impressive too, is this new Direct Lake. So pause there for questions.
Absolutely. And there is one. Yep.
Yeah, so I use Z order right now in Delta Lake and also Databricks. Is that similar to B order? Or are they totally different things?
It's I know the names. It's somewhat similar. It's kind of a compression, or it's the way the lays out the data. So so think of it taking Z order and going one step further and compressing it even more. Really, I shouldn't even call it compression. It's more of ordering the data in a way that's better for Power BI to use, but doesn't give you any benefit if you're using Databricks.
Okay.
Cool. Yes.
I see that bullet point on there about Power BI desktop used for authoring would cause all that to direct query. So does that mean for Direct Lake, you're supposed to author everything through the web, through the Power BI portal experience?
Well, what that's saying is desktop cannot use Direct Lake yet. So desktop would have to use direct query. That's kind of what I was saying there. So there are things that desktop doesn't support yet with Fabric and OneLake, and Direct Lake is one of those.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So basically the workaround you're saying is that build a data set online that uses Direct Lake, and then in Power BI desktop, do connectivity to that data set that is published in Power BI. So you have direct query from, I guess, Power BI desktop to the service, and from there you've got Direct Lake. Is that what this means?
That's it. Yeah, because people were like, well, if I create this in Direct Lake, does that mean I cannot use it in desktop? Well, you can still you can use it. You're using direct query mode for that.
Gotcha.
That's what that means.
Any other questions to kind of, James, do you have anything else to cover? We had a few more minutes, or we are pretty much done.
That's it. I'll end with there's some resources that you can have in this deck. And then if should I use Fabric now? I tell customers definitely use it for prototyping or piloting. If you're not going to use anything in production for several months, because this will GA by then, and so you can start using Fabric now. If you're okay with bugs and missing features and some performance issues, that's going to be in a public preview. That's just with anything in there. And I would say if you have hundreds of terabytes, I would say you'd be pushing its limits right now, and I would wait on that. Other than that, I see a lot of customers, they're diving in the Fabric now. A lot of customers using prototyping, but even more, they're going to build a new project, a new data warehouse project, which takes months. So, okay, let's use Fabric now. As long as Fabric will give us everything we need. And very importantly, I forgot to mention is they are, I think next week, going to publish a roadmap for Fabric, like they have with Power BI. You know, you have that section of what's in Power BI and the roadmap of what's coming. They're going to add the Fabric stuff. So they're going to be a lot more transparent of what they're doing in Fabric and when things are going to land. It's not going to have GA dates, but it will say, like, James, you mentioned one security is not there. When is it going to be in there? Well, it'll say one security and they'll have the date when it's going to be in public preview. So if you see things missing, this guide will tell you when things are going to be in public preview. And then some of that may be after it's going to GA, although you'd have to know the GA date. But this allows customers to plan accordingly with that roadmap.
And just to confirm something, so let's say I'm a customer, premium customer, I'm on Power BI Premium, and I have some cases that can benefit from Fabric. My understanding is that if you're on Power BI Premium, you automatically get Fabric features and you don't have to pay more. Now, obviously, there is a capacity utilization. I'm adding additional workloads here. So I'm running into a situation where my capacity can be overutilized. But let's say if that's not the case, Fabric, I just want to confirm that Fabric is available with Power BI Premium today, right? I don't
Right.
have to, right?
Right, that's what I showed here. And if you're doing Power BI stuff, you'll still be charged for that. If you start doing Fabric stuff like a lakehouse and a warehouse, you won't be charged for that. If you're using, so this, I won't get into it, but if you go into it and you say, I want to use Fabric, you have the ability to create a trial. And if you're using the trial, you won't be charged for that. Even if you're not using the trial, I think through the end of August, it still is free. But check with a Microsoft rep or send me an email and I'll follow up with you. Because I don't want you to suddenly get a big bill. But yes, Power BI Premium gives you access to all the Fabric stuff. Where you got to pay attention to is when am I going to start getting charged for that Fabric stuff? You're always going to be charged for Power BI stuff, but Fabric stuff, you won't be charged now in most situations.
So then what situations will incur additional charge if I'm on premium, in a premium capacity?
If they change the date, so I think it's the end of August, where if you're in Power BI Premium and you're not using Fabric trial, you will start getting charged for it.
So maybe this is where I don't understand, because going back to my original question, let's say I'm not on a trial, I have a premium capacity and I enable Fabric features like Lakehouse or something like this. Are they going to charge me in addition to Power BI Premium? Let's say I'm on a P1 plan, $5,000 per month. I'm using a Lakehouse or a warehouse. Will there be additional charges on my bill?
Well, so we'll do it this way. If I'm in here and I want to create a new workspace, if I create a new workspace and I choose Fabric capacity, then I have the ability to go and create lakehouses and warehouses. If I have a workspace and I don't choose that, I can't do that stuff. So it applies to somebody creates the workspace and says, oh, in this workspace, I want to use some of the Fabric stuff. Now they have the option in here. I don't have it in mine anymore, but you can see up here, it's the trial. So at sometimes you can go in there and it'll I forget what triggers it, but it'll say, do you want to use a Fabric capacity trial? If you're using a trial, pay attention to that number. You will not get charged for any of the Fabric stuff, only the Power BI stuff. If I if I don't use a trial and I create a Fabric capacity, I'm going to be charged for Power BI. I'm not going to be charged for Fabric capacity, we'll say until the end of August, and then I'm going to start getting charged for features I'm using that are considered Fabric features.
So it sounds like if I'm on a Power BI Premium capacity, the original capacity, I cannot use Fabric features unless I choose to create a new Fabric capacity.
So let me clarify. If you have a Power BI workspace and you decide I want to use Fabric, I could either create a new workspace and use Fabric, or I can take that existing workspace and convert it to a Fabric, or I don't, it's hard to word this right. I can have that Power BI workspace. If my admin had went into the admin portal and say everybody can use Fabric features, then I can go and start using those features underneath my Power BI Premium capacity and be charged for them at the end of August.
Okay. All right.
So really it comes down to if I go here, if I go to create, if I'm in if I'm in a Power BI workspace, I'm always going to be charged for this no matter what. That doesn't go away. If I decide, oh, wow, look at this warehouse thing, I want to create that, I have to have the admin say, yes, James, you can use Fabric. and then I have to take my workspace and assign it to a Fabric capacity and choose a Fabric capacity with all those pricing points. And I'm going to be, I'm going to get charged for that if I do something under Fabric, like a warehouse. But you're not
Okay.
going to be charged until September because of
Thanks. Okay.
they're trying to get people to use it. And this is very confusing. I know I should probably have a chart on this. So the bottom line is if your admin says, no, you can't use Fabric, you can say, okay, I'm going to go create my own tenant under my own email, and I can get a trial and I can start playing with it that way.
Well, I was thinking more like a customer. They're on P1, let's say capacity. They want to use Fabric. They don't want to pay anything more. So they got budget for P1. They already paid 5,000, let's say, per month. Can I use Fabric without being charged? And it
Yes.
looks like the answer is no.
No, you can use it if you go and choose a Fabric trial.
Right. But the trial eventually is going to expire, right? That's the definition of a trial.
Well,
And when it
eventually-
expires,
yeah, eventually you have to pay for it, everything.
that's-
Now,
that's-
you also think about, I may want to create a new workspace and use Fabric because I don't want to mess with my current workspace, but I got all this Power BI stuff underneath it. So you can come in here and say, oh, look, I want to play with it. Your admin can go, okay, I'll turn it on for you. And you can say, I'm not going to mess with my current workspaces because I got everything set up. I'll create a new workspace. I'll use a Fabric capacity. And it's going to say, do you want to use the trial? You can go, yes. Boom, 60 days, play with it all you want. You're not going to be charged.
Right. Okay. Good. Last questions for James? No. All right. Well, James, thank you so much for doing this. We got to do it again to do a little bit kind of drill more into these things when Fabric kind of matures. But thank you again for sharing your expertise. This looks like very exciting times.
Yeah, it's a really awesome product. I'm very excited about it. Any follow-up questions, there's my email. Send it to me. I'll send you this deck, Theo, and you can post it or send it out there. And then happy to have any, I know you're doing other follow-ups in there, but even a few months from now, you can say what's new in Fabric. We can always go over that, or any of those other things that I listed here that I didn't cover. We can always go over that too.
Sounds good. Awesome. Guys, thank you much.
Thank you.
Thank you to James. Thank you very much for coming. You deserve extra pizza. I'm not sure if there is anything left for beating the elements today, but if you've got more pizza, please feel free to get another one. Yeah, we're getting a storm, and I think we're probably expecting a second wave or something like this. So I'll see you September 11. Gonna drill more into that. Gonna drill into Lakehouse, as I mentioned. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
James, thank you so much.
Okay, bye.